I guess the point here is a third space possible, or if we were to theorize something or move towards an agreement or a consensus between these two sides, what can we do? And for me, this requires reorienting this discussion from, if we're looking at things from a normative perspective, it's Islam versus the state, or it's Islam versus modernity, for instance. We create this dichotomy, and this is something that Halak also does. Whereas if we approach these questions from the perspective of Islamic law or from fiqh, then we quickly come to the realization, this is something Salman Yunus nicely put. He said that Islamic law has 5 categories. There is no 6th category of impossible. Something is either permissible, or it's an obligation, or it's recommended, or it's it's prohibited, etc. You have 5 categories. Everything falls under those 5 categories, and therefore, devising a government or a state or a praxis align a trajectory for action cannot, by definition, considering that the deen of Islam is perfect, it cannot be impossible and it cannot be unknown. So the question is, okay, what is that? What is that solution, or that? How can we pave that path? And the first thing, going back to the previous slide, or relating to the previous slide, again, perhaps the easiest to understand is the notion of Islamic unity, that loyalty and friendship and rights are on the basis of a person's relationship and subservience to their creator instead of the state. So the idea, for instance, that you can have citizenship based on where a person is born, and that a Muslim, who traditionally deserves all of the rights of a Muslim, has less rights if he's not a citizen than a non-Muslim who does have a citizenship, again, is something completely, entirely in contradiction to the core essence, forget about Islamic law, to the core essence of Tawheed, which is that every Muslim is the friend of another Muslim, has the obligation and the requirement to respect them and to give them their due rights. You also have a very wide level of freedom and rights given to non-Muslims, but this is first and foremost given to Muslims. In other words, the identity and the national identity can't be on the basis of a certain area or that kind of thing. And for this reason, Brother Paul, I would say that a number of so-called Islamic movements who argue for the compatibility of Islam and the state immediately fail the second we enter into the subject of citizenship, because here there's a very direct contradiction. This is something we see that we're seeing in Syria. It's something that we saw in Afghanistan. So-called Islamic change is really directly, this contradiction is most clearly apparent in this area. Secondly, there is what I call self-government and decentralization. We have to recognize that unity, real unity, political unity, religious unity, etc., requires organic self-governance of societies, as opposed to centralization and uniformization of all of the citizens. If you look at the Rashidun Caliphate, again, they didn't have the technology, but they somehow managed to maintain very clear, standards of operation and objectivity and communication and standards of justice, appointing people, etc., despite not having any of those official procedures. The Ottoman Empire similarly had the millet system, which I won't elaborate on. But the point here is that this can be done, and this will relate to the third point. But I'll finally say on this point that, again, related to political decentralization, there has to be financial decentralization. And the very fact that an Islamic state, this is my argument and something that a number of Islamic political theorists disagree with me on, which is that the state cannot tax people beyond the stated or legislated taxes. So, like the zakat and the kharaj, those are which are clearly defined. In other words, you can't just go and tax people, progressive taxation, take 50% of their wealth, put that into the system, and because you don't have those financial resources, you're not able to spend them on centralizing projects like education, like censorship, like the police state, like surveillance cameras and everything else. So there's a relationship, a symbiotic relationship between the political and the financial. And then with regard to decision making and sort of organic styles of organic decision making and taqwa-centered governance, we can imagine this on the level of the government and on the level of an Islamic of the the interaction between the citizen and the state. So from the level of the government, we basically have Islamic governance really is, or institutions are defined by or are characterized as highly interpersonal, and they use taqwa as, fear of God, as the social currency on which decisions are made and on which people are appointed to positions, etc. This is very essential to the concept of Islamic governance, as opposed to the modern state, which takes utility maximization or technocracy or efficiency as the main social currency that applies to or that is given value in the state or in the government culture. And here comes the point on Islamic akhlaq, sort of being in contradiction to centralizing centralization and uniformity. The more akhlaq and adab and internal regulation that you have among the citizenry, the more habitus, or as Sabah Mahmoud called it, or the more that people embody the social processes of fearing God in their lives, the less you need centralized regulations and control over the citizenry, because that's something that comes from the inside. The volition comes from the inside. And this is where Weber disagreed. And he was like, no way, this is the opposite. Centralization and rationalization is more objective, and it's better and more efficient. And I think the best refutation for that, Brother Paul, is if you look at the Muslim world, you can see that no amount of procedure or bureaucracy can reform corrupt people if they want to be corrupt, or they want to seek loopholes in the law.
But also, positively speaking, this fear of Allah rather than the fear of state, that this kind of you put there in that table very interestingly. So I've seen it in places like Qatar and many other places where thieving and theft and public disorder and antisocial behavior is quite rare, actually, or even non-existent, as far as I can see in some places in the Muslim world. And this is not because of a repressive surveillance state, watching everyone. No. It's this internal self-control which comes from fear of Allah, as you put it, Taqwa-centered governance. And this seems to be, in other words, Islam, another way of putting it, is something that regulates people's lives. People want to do well to please God. They want to avoid punishment from God. That it's not the state, it's God. It's a theocentric civil society rather than a fear of the state kind of polity, which seems to be operational. And it makes a real difference in terms of civil society, the quality of people's lives. Yes, there's corruption, all that exists as well. But on the level, it's really quite surprising as a Westerner when you go there and you see how different things are in many of these places. And this is all to do with Islam. It's not to do with the kind of Western understandings of an intrusive state forcing everyone to conform in certain ways.
And you don't need to go back to the Khilafah Rashida time to see that. This is the point. And so this really actually, thank you for mentioning this, Brother Paul, because this brings me right into the final point that I had on subject-state interaction, which is to say that this concept of a God-centric and Allah-centric approach to government is manifests itself in the individual subject. The subject is a subject of God, not a subject of the state. And so the example of this is in social regulation and crime and punishment, it shifts the fear of the state to a fear of God. And so in this regulation, this is something that takes place in society. It's not only individual. In addition to the individual, you have the concept of shame. The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, if you do not have shame, then do as you wish, right? And today we have the concept of shame is so removed from our societies that people will take this literally and literally do whatever they want. But the point here is that, and I'll give you, the book In Defense of Flogging, the famous book that Muslims use in order to sort of back up their position on had punishments. The argument in that book is actually different. The argument in Defense of Flogging is that the pain that a person experiences from the punishment prevents him from doing it again.
Is this the book? Or maybe not. Just in Pain for the Corporal Punishment of Criminals, Graham Newman.
You have the...
Let me just...
No, there's one. It's called In Defense of Flogging. It's a bit more of a popular book.
Oh, I see. This is an academic book by actually a criminologist, professor of criminology in the US, in New York.
It's very popular. Yeah.
It's actually fascinating argument. It's slightly different from what you're maybe.
No, it's a different one. Yeah, you're right. So I'm not sure if that's applicable for this book, and maybe it's not. But the point here is the Islamic concept of punishment is actually different to this, because it's not about causing pain. You're not allowed to actually cause that much pain. You can't leave any permanent marks. It's about the shame that the person experiences, so they don't do it again. And the fact that from the time of the early Muslims all the way until now, you have Muslims who feel shame committing a sin. The state would not ever find out what they did. Personally coming in, turning themselves in to receive the punishment. This is an evidence that this Taqwa-centric framework and style of governance is indeed possible. It just requires that the subject formation that you have, the slavery and the formation of the subject and of the individual and of the slave is not of or in relation to the state. It's about internal purification. It's about education. It's about social initiatives. It's about institutions, and all of which the state also has to enforce, their sort of civil religion. But what we have to work towards, and this is really my final point, is basically understanding that there is a way forward. However, there is a lot of intellectual work that needs to be done. We need people who are sociologists, political scientists, historians, people in the social sciences, who are also equally versed in fiqh and in usul and in aqidah, who can really synthesize the understanding of the world, that's the waqir, with the understanding of the deen, that's the divine command, and pave that path forward to reforming society from the bottom up, while at the same time theorizing a blueprint. And I think here's where we really lack, theorizing a blueprint for reforming state structures from the top down. Jazakallah khair. That's most of what I wanted to say.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Gosh, there's so many threads one could take up there and develop. So can I just throw some random things at you from my reading of your
definitely let's just
paper? Thank you. You say
organic.
If it's exactly, you say in the paper that the Islamic polity is built on an intimately powerful bond between creator and creation that is in no way dependent on state authority. That sums up pretty much what you've been saying anyway in the last few minutes. And then you have a little quote, a footnote, 27. Thus the Shemitian dictum that all significant concepts of modern political theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. This is a statement by Charles Schmitt in the concept of the political. He was his biography is extraordinary. I'm not going to go there, but anyway, he says all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, and that struck me as absolutely true. They're not. They don't just come from a secular world. They are secularized theological concepts. Do you agree with that?
The better question, and absolutely, and I would say to complete your point, I would say, what is secularism to begin with? The moment we see the secular as just objective nothingness, just like the color white, and you can, color it in with whatever you want, that's where we fail. The state, the secular is a framework provided by the state. You can fill it in with religion, you can fill it in with humanism, you can fill it in with capitalism, with whatever you want, but the state is at the top of that monopoly, or it's at the top of that structure. So when I'll try to give an example. When France banned the niqab, and when they banned the hijab in schools, they did so. They, obviously Muslims, they took them to court. They took the French government to court, to the European Court of Human Rights, and they argued that this is against religious freedom because you're allowed to wear hijab, and that's an obligation in our deen. The argument that the French government made to pass the legislation to the National Assembly to pass the ban was that this was not in opposition to religious freedom, because freedom of religion is about the belief that you have on the inside. So you can practice and wear your hijab and do whatever in your own home, but the second you take that into the public, that's not the domain of religion. And obviously from an Islamic perspective, this is not true, because Islam is something which is public, it takes place outside of the home, it is social. But here's the point. France can still assert that this is secularism, because they are the ones who define religion. They define those concepts that we use to seek legitimacy for. And here's the sort of when we have, for instance, Muslims trying to seek justice for Palestine by taking Netanyahu to the International Court of Justice. This is the same sort of fallacy that we're going through. They're the ones who designed that system, and so seeking sort of remedies from a colonial legacy system. Again, it's politically, besides being theologically problematic, is also politically not tenable, because the colonialists understood, the colonists understood that if we want to change Islamic society and make it, whatever we want to make it, make it a part of the capitalist system and impose, so-called liberal freedoms or liberalism upon it, then we have to destroy all of the institutions and rebuild everything from the top. The genocide and the genocides that were committed in the process far outnumbered what we saw in Gaza, for instance. It was horrific. And so the question now is, to what extent does a similar change need to occur in order to bring it back? And that's really where Halak says, but that's beyond my pay grade. And where Muslims take that and say, actually, this definitely needs to be possible.
Okay. Another thing you say in your paper, you say, what this is talking about in an Islamic society, an authentic one. Why should the monitoring and prosecution of those who disobey Allah not be a priority of an Islamic state, especially where these laws are designed to protect the society itself? And then you say the Islamic tradition is rich with responses, and then you quote an extraordinary story, a famous narration of a hadith. Which I want to share, because many people in the West won't know about this. It says, finally, we may recall the famous narration of Umar al-Khattab, who, as caliph, was once patrolling the streets of Medina with a companion, when they heard a rowdy party, it's a drinking party, taking place in the house of a certain companion. Upon investigating, Umar told his friend, "They are drinking alcohol right now. This is in Medina. What do you think we ought to do?" His companion responded, "I think we have fallen into what Allah prohibited. Allah prohibited us saying, and do not spy on one another, for we had indeed spied." So, this whole idea of spying in Islam on Muslims, the Prophet upon him peace instructed people that spying, or an act of seeking out secretly or opening the faults of people, is itself a cause of moral corruption, and that applies to those in authority as well, including those who are caliphs. And so you get this extraordinary, you have the private realm and you have the public realm, and you're not supposed to spy on people. So this idea, even in a full-orbed Islamic context, the state can't intrusively seek out faults of people, to expose them, to bring them into the public domain. No, they are to remain there, because we have the emphasis on the fear of God. It's not on the fear of the state; it's on the fear of God. So it's between you and God. Doesn't mean that sins become halal, but in terms of the state's surveillance and prosecution of wrongdoing, that is limited. It's limited by strict boundaries, which you discuss in your paper. I thought that was very interesting. A lot of people are not aware of that. Maybe even some Muslims. I don't know.
Absolutely. When we think in terms of, because we think in terms of modernity in the modern state, when we try to seek an Islamic solution to a problem, we will often make the very same mistakes. Whereas we don't realize that interfering in a person's private matters or in the private sin, as long as someone else is not being harmed in the process, actually it's not only against the concept of a person fearing God, it interferes with the personal relationship that person has with God, because later on, maybe they're sinning now, but they'll reform themselves at a later point in time. And I think from an Islamic governance perspective, this needs to be complemented by the way Islamic governments treats the governors themselves. Because the way the Islamic law treats the governors is in fact very harsh. You can send spies on them, you can collect intelligence on them, you can follow them around, you can literally go into their house, as Umar famously did on many occasions. Well, he would invite them and be like, "Look, we received reports that you're eating white bread. We received reports that you're riding a fancy horse. We received reports that you have fancy clothing. You better change that or I'm going to fire you." And the point here is that the Islamic style of governance is harsh on the governors because they're expected to set that standard, and easy and relaxed with the public. And today, we look at the modern state, and you look at corrupt states, or even so-called with states with little levels of corruption. It's the exact opposite. The political elites, they get off on any crimes that they commit, from personal injustices to stealing money to anything else. And the people are the ones who have to, the citizens have to bear the brunt of all of the oppression and the crime.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.